Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer, and if you're watching us on YouTube, you can always take the Lunch Hour with you wherever you go on one of the many fine podcast platforms at which you can find our show. If you're listening to us on one of those many fine podcast platforms and you want to see what's going on in the studio, well, go and check us out on our YouTube channel. Leave us a comment, subscribe, like, do all the things that you're supposed to do. And more to the point, let your friends know, let your family members know, let your friends' family members and your family members' friends all know that you're enjoying the Federal Newswire's Lunch Hour podcast. This is a very special edition of the Lunch Hour. You've seen me with guests from the Competitive Enterprise Institute on having them on before. This is very special because we are on the precipice, the eve, as it were, of the 40th anniversary dinner of CEI. And joining us today is Kent Lassman. Kent Lassman is the president, the third president of the Competitive Enterprise Institute. He's been in that role since, I believe, 2016. He's got his start in public policy 30 years ago with, I believe, the Progress and Freedom Foundation. He's got an undergraduate degree from Catholic University. He's got a master's in public administration. I have one of those too, Kent. Yours is from North Carolina State University. And let's jump into it, Kent. I mean, CEI, I believe, was founded in an office above a bakery by Fred Smith. A handful of employees. It's now grown to the powerhouse. Do you think Fred would, well, obviously I know Fred would be proud of it, but what do you think Fred would think of, where CEI is today from that above the bakery office up on Capitol Hill?
Well, first of all, good on you for having historical facts, for knowing these things, for tracking down the development of institutions and whatnot. And I should say right off the top to your audience, to your listeners, I'm really grateful for what you're doing, spotlighting important issues and the people that are addressing them.
Thanks.
And bringing new ideas forward. And that's part and parcel of what Fred's vision was way back in 1984. He had been something of he'd been a convert. He'd been something of a refugee, a very bright, charismatic, energetic Southern transplant who came to Washington to work at the EPA and quickly became disillusioned at the harms that were caused by these regulatory institutions.
Right.
And, all the good intentions in the world didn't really matter if the way you were affecting people's lives was negative. And one of the things that I know matters to Fred, he's still with us. He still checks in on our work. He follows, he and Fran, his lovely wife, follow our activities, and he's a member of our board of directors. One of the things that I know is important to him and that I've been particularly pleased, to stay on the right side of is he has watched over the last 40 years institutions drift away from what they do best, from their mission, from those core principles that animate their beliefs about, in our case, about entrepreneurship and the value of what individuals can bring to bear as opposed to government institutions. And he's very pleased, and I'm very pleased to work with people that want to keep us on point.
Sure.
And keep us on mission.
So, I'll go here next. So you've been president of CEI, since 2016? So 8 years into the job. Took over there was a between period in which Lawson Bader served. Lawson Bader then went over to Donors Trust. What most surprised you about becoming CEI president, that you hadn't known before? What was that? Well, talk about some of the challenges therein, if you want to. I mean, obviously, if you don't want to, but talk about what surprised you the most.
There's this dilemma or tension, and I'll stick with Fred Smith for just a moment.
Sure, please.
Because he and I had this kind of vaudeville style joke that we did over and over again because we were colleagues for a couple of years there.
Yeah,
where he was serving as a senior fellow. So I came into the organization and I knew some of the senior fellows. I knew some of the policy people. I didn't know the whole organization.
Sure.
Obviously, there's a lot more going on than people who study and write and advocate or give testimony and whatnot. But I knew some of the people, and I knew what to expect about their dedication, their skills, the type of work that they produced. And Fred would say to me, as I would sometimes scratch my head or wonder how this piece fit with that piece, or how we could better maybe get a little bit of an efficiency out of these two different folks who are studying two different things, and they might learn from each other. He would say, Kent, my favorite form of management. And it was like a call and response. And
Sure.
My job was to say, no, Fred, what is that? And he would say, don't manage.
Yes.
So I think there's a really wonderful gift baked into the culture here of allowing people to pursue projects that aren't yet clear as far as where they're going to land, to follow their passions and develop expertise in policy areas that maybe are up and coming and are not yet on the front pages. But there's a tension with making sure that we're doing the work that really informs the debate and helps policymakers do a better job. And
I want to come back to what sets CEI apart. I mean, it's funny because I can hear Fred saying that with the the little click of the tongue, or whatever you would call that sound that Fred makes. Not a week goes by. I do a podcast with another CEI alumnus, Jerry Rogers. Now the editor of Real Clear Policy and Real Clear Health. Andrew and Jerry Save the World. And not a week goes by when we're not quoting something that Fred said to us when we were both at CEI, 20 plus years ago. And a lot of times it's some variation on the phrase, people are stupid because they're smart. The concept of, people are not engaged in public policy because they're too busy smartly focused on what's happening in their own lives. But part of what CEI does is it sort of makes it really clear how these policies are affecting people in their daily lives. There has been a real transition in politics and policy, not that CEI is particularly political, but on the issue of, it used to be you could go along and get along, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but sort of be uninvolved in politics to a degree. But now we're living in a world in which you will be made to care. And if you're not part of the prevailing political or policy narrative, you're going to be made to suffer for it. So now you can't be stupid because you're smart. Now you gotta engage. Where do you see CEI's role in all of that, in terms of better informing or getting active on these things? Where does CEI fit in here?
Yeah, that's a great little aphorism.
Yeah,
and one of the tools, the mental maps that I use that might help with this is. And it's only a model, right? It's not exactly the way that our world is or exactly the way we live our lives. But I think of it in terms of, there is that which is the public sphere and that which is the private sphere.
Sure.
And these are pretty intuitive, I think, to most people paying attention in the world. The public sphere are those things that have to do with rules about how we get along with each other.
Mm-hmm.
Rules that prevent somebody from being unjustly harmed by another, or creating the processes so that you can get redress if there's been a problem.
Right.
And then there is all the really wonderful, the richness of our private sphere. It's the family. It's the religious and civic sector. It's all the things that we do with neighborhood get-togethers and music festivals and art and whatever you care most about. It's likely in the private sphere.
Sure.
And I think you are right to put your finger on that. More and more, the public sphere has these tentacles, fingers reaching out into the private sphere. And it's not always saying you just can no longer do or organize or associate or speak the way that you want to. But it's shading, well, you have to do it in this way. Or when you do it, you have to fill out those forms. Or you can only do it with a permit. And our job, a very important job, is to not just hold that line, to create a bulwark against the public sphere interjecting itself into the private sphere, but
Sure.
to actively push back and expand the private sphere of life. Because all of the things that we care most about, whether you're talking about economics, private investment, risk-taking, the price system, or you're just talking about the things that are at your kitchen table. Where should we send our kids to school? What does it look like for care for our parents and the next generation ahead of us? How do we deal with this thing that is happening in our town that we may like or dislike? All of those questions, we want more room, more space, more resources available for people to handle them in the private sphere, because that's the miracle of what American life is about, and that's what we care about.
It's good, and it sort of sets up to sort of the mission, and it underscores, it leads nicely into my next question. So when I was at CEI from 99 to 2002, it seems like much longer, but it was not that long a time. Obviously, long-standing relationship with the organization. And when I went off, I worked as a lobbyist for a small business trade association for a number of years after that, and then went off on my own. And I was very fortunate to have a mentor in terms of talking about organizations like a CEI or then the Institute for Liberty or what have you. And he said, Andrew, I always come back to the acronym SUM, S-U-M, that an organization or an organization's projects have to be strategic, they have to be unique, and they have to be measurable. Now, I want to get your thoughts on whether or not you think that that's a good guide. You're free to disagree with that. I've always found it to be a really handy guide. But if you do, then talk about, how CEI plays into this. What sets CEI apart from other organizations? What are the unique things that you're doing? How do you guys measure success?
Yeah, I'm gonna start in reverse.
Sure.
With that measurement, because I think it really helps illustrate the strategic aspect.
Before you do that, because that's actually a really good place, because I've had talks with folks who are both former CEI alumni and folks who are in the policy world generally, who are, have left because they've gotten frustrated with, what's the impact that we're having. But I'm sorry, Ken, go ahead, take it away.
Yep. I'm going to start there because, like I said, I think it helps illuminate. It helps us understand what makes something strategic or not strategic.
Sure.
So the metrics movement, whether it's in private enterprise or it's in government institutions or other nonprofits, or especially in the public policy sphere, this is a wholly good thing. But clearly, like any good thing, the dose makes the poison. Right?
Sure.
If you over focus on counting a certain behavior or outcome, then people tend to follow their instincts and they produce more of that thing.
Right.
And maybe that thing is only an input to some larger goal, some strategic goal. So I think of metrics this way. It is important for us to track how many times our senior fellows are invited to testify. It's important to know how many provisions of law that are introduced were actually drafted here.
Yeah.
Right. People came up with. And the metrics about media, the metrics about government relations, the metrics about outcomes that are easy to see and count, those matter. We take care to make an honest tabulation, and they don't tend to, in a given category, be the same every year. They vary depending on what the political circumstance looks like. But the metric that matters most, and this is the one where it's less easy to see, and it requires a degree of kind of prudential judgment. It requires making a call, and then having the trust of people who are reading that metric or hearing from you, that they know you are being honest about it. Is I say, how many times did a policy change?
Right.
How many times did a policy change because CEI showed up?
Right.
Now that's where the prudential judgment comes in, right? Because there's all sorts of issues in a given time window, a year and a 5-year window, whatever, where you can say, oh yeah, I wrote a piece about that. Or I had this great conversation with a congressman at a cocktail party. And you have to be able to be honest with yourself and say, did we really affect that debate?
Right.
And a lot of the team here, they get nervous when I do the following, but I think it's important for us. At the end of the year over year, when I sit down with the senior policy managers, issue managers, and we review success, typically we have 2, 3, 4 genuine successes.
Right.
That's it.
Yeah.
and they get nervous. They say, well, you can't tell people we only had 4 wins. I say, no. We had all these other things that are, the op-eds in the Wall Street Journal and the testimony and the invitation for private briefing. Those things are pointing to next year's wins.
Right.
And the year after.
That's a good point. Because I got asked this. I do, in addition to the media work that I do policy work. Regulatory policy is near and dear to my heart. And I had a listener a couple of weeks ago sort of say, well, what have you done? What have you, and you're right. Yeah. It's how you can point to X and you can point to Y, and then you've got to be prudential and sort of how you say, well, what was the influence that I had on this? And, anyway, sorry, go ahead, Ken. Yeah. I interrupted.
Well, no, I think that brings us back to the first part of your acronym, making it a sum or additive. Right?
Yeah.
So the S there, is about strategy.
Yeah.
Right. And strategy, I love that you use that word, that it influences how you think about things. I have borrowed, it came from military planners, but I've borrowed a kind of a 4-step process. It's an intellectual process. It's not a standalone thing to think about that. And it goes vision, strategy, project, tactics.
Sure.
Right. And for every vision, you're going to have multiple strategies. For each strategy, you'll have multiple projects, etc. Strategies are those things that here we most typically talk about in terms of, is it aligned with, is it on point with, in keeping with our core mission.
Right.
Right. And some of the strategic calls that become more difficult, they'll be familiar to your audience. You have a sophisticated audience here, right?
Oh, yeah.
In policy debates, there's generally a tension between, do you hold out for the more pure answer, or do you take half a loaf now?
Right.
Right. And one of the influences on that calculus, that tension, is if you take half a loaf, there's something of a hydraulic theory of policy change, which means if you get a piece of legislation passed, but it doesn't really do everything that you want, it might take the pressure off. It's a release valve.
Sure.
And they might not take that question up again for another 5 or 7 years. Oftentimes, you look at something like the ag appropriations bill. It comes up every 5 years.
Right.
Every 5 years, you get a chance to change that or influence that. So that tension about, are we asking for enough? Are we giving the lawmakers or the regulators enough tools to really reach further in a deregulatory way? Again, it comes back to this prudential judgment.
Sure.
But really, I think we have a role, and now a history of 4 decades of history, where our job, our self-appointed job, and then subsequently what people expect of us, is we will name and push for and advocate and create as much of the conditions as possible politically so that people can go as far as possible toward a free market solution that is still within the bounds of reason.
Right.
I will not be winning awards here for the Nozick Libertarian Award, because we are going to come up just shy of that, because most policymakers won't go all the way.
Sure.
And that's, I'm okay with that.
Right.
Because along the way, we're making repeated incremental progress.
But it gets back to something that Fred used to talk about as we would have these policy discussions, which is to not pre-negotiate against yourself, right? Which far too many organizations and far too many leaders within organizations are like, well, we're never going to get that, so let's go up with this position. And we know that the statists, the folks who are looking to expand the size of government, they're not, in fact, not that I want to get overly political, because I really don't, but on the policy fronts, I think that's part of what we've been seeing over the last 3.5 years is the administration make outlandish regulatory proposals that are alarming in their own right, to see just how far they can go. And we, in the end, they will negotiate, in the rulemaking, and they will be much, much further down that statist big government side of things than we would ever want them to be. And they can claim that they compromise slightly. I mean, I don't know if you want to talk about that or comment on that, but even with the regulatory measurement tools. What they proposed was outrageous. What they came up with was still outrageous, but just shy of where they were before. We spend far too much time negotiating against ourselves, I think. Your thoughts here?
I think that's right.
No.
And I don't want to belabor this because it lends itself to going into kind of calling names or naming people.
No, it's fine.
Things like that. But I think what it illustrates, that habit, which I think of the way you're describing it, it's a bad habit, pre-negotiating against the good. It's illustrative of a lack of confidence in your own ideas.
Sure.
And that's the problem. You need to be confident in your ideas, to have really that core belief. You need to do the hard work of studying the policy and studying the economics of it and understanding the law. And that's difficult and tedious. And sometimes if I've seen allies who they don't want to do the legwork, and therefore they're not quite as sure of the solution, and they'll pre-negotiate.
Yeah.
Right. They'll say, we'll look for something a little bit less. But I would, but to stick with this, I would point out just a concrete kind of case study as far as pushing that limit. There was the specific agency and the specific regulator doesn't matter for the story here.
Sure.
But there was a horrendous, just kind of economy stopping proposal out of the Obama team in their last year. And when the next administration came in, they took their time. First of all, they put a freeze on the regulation. And then they took their time and said, we're going to have a replacement because we think that's how we can succeed and have it withstand and be durable legally. We will have a replacement rule for what the Obama team had proposed. And when that finally worked through the process, it took 2.5 years. And there was one very narrow, small provision that we at CEI took issue with.
Sure.
It was an interpretation of, way down in the weeds, subsection dot this dot that provision of a major law. And the rest of the proposal was wonderful. It was spot on. It used science well, good economic analysis. It was well drafted. And so I went to the administrator and I said, I'm going to wait about 45 days until this shows up in the Federal Register. And then on this very narrow provision, I'm likely to go forward and tell people what a great rule this is, except for.
Sure.
And then I will sue you. I'm going to sue on that provision. And he looked me dead in the eye and he said, I knew that was coming. And that was a political judgment. I had to make that judgment so that I could, keep the different part of the coalition together so that I would have support to advance this rule.
Right.
Now, that sort of conversation and that judgment about how far one could really push, we're going to end up disagreeing on. But the point there is, friends, allies, different legal scholars, they will disagree on how far you can take a provision of the law. But that sort of behavior is healthy. That debate is
100%.
healthy. And it's unhealthy had the administrator said, well, I'm just going to take what the Obama team did and cut it in half and put that forward.
Yeah.
Right. That's the pre-negotiation that we don't want to see at all.
And the other part of this, right, is also a certain maturity in tactics. Again, not to take anything away from Fred, who I love and adore and admire. But, there was a time when I think CEI would have just gone to war and not had that negotiation. And that's a good, let's not think, not a negotiation, but had a discussion first. I think that's a very good way to do it. It's an understanding of the way things work, and having that conversation, getting that explanation is so vitally helpful. You go and you sue anyway, but it's nevertheless, the fair warning is there, right? I think that's the way you have to do this, don't you?
It really does require, in this, this can be a problem area. We have to always be mindful of this. We always have to check our impulses. People get cozy in Washington.
100%.
That's a It's not just something to be said. That is a genuine risk and danger. But we have to ask ourselves, how far, given the institutional constraints, given the incentives that are set up, given the political dynamics, how far can we expect this regulator to go?
Right.
And knowing that, making that judgment about regulator X, how far she can go or he can go, we know that we can make the argument for something better than that, and then push them to go all the way there.
Yeah.
And that's a really healthy, it's kind of second order analysis, right? Because the first order is, what's the best policy? And in some ways, that's an easier question to answer.
Now, let me ask you this. I've never actually asked you. This is going to be a little bit out of left field there, Kemp, but just stick with me for a second. Because there is this debate amongst folks who do a lot of regulatory policy work about whether or not the Administrative Procedure Act is a good thing, whether or not it gives the agencies too much power. There's an argument that some are making that it should be thrown out. I actually, and may surprise you depending on where you are, but I'm someone who believes that the Administrative Procedure Act, the APA, gives us as much as it takes away. And I think it's the deliberative approach is a good thing. Have you given any consideration to this, where you sort of stand in all this?
Yeah, the APA, God bless you. I mean, most of our policy friends don't know what the APA is.
Sure. Yes.
But not only do I have a considered opinion on it, is
right.
I love it. This is my favorite kind of podcast.
Oh yeah, no, listen.
I think there's a couple different questions baked into what you were saying there.
Yeah.
The concept of having a general law that guides and creates the process for the behavior of regulatory agencies is wholly a good thing.
Yes.
Because we want that process to be governed by statute. We don't want that process governed by politics or by the whims of an agency administrator or department head. So having a law in place fundamentally is instructive to the public administrator, but it's also a tool for those of us who want to say, you've gone too far.
Right.
And that's where the litigation strategies come in. So as it stands, just in concept, it's a great thing to have the current APA, which was put in place some 60 years ago, versus no APA. I'd take the current law.
Sure.
The current law, I think, needs to be rewritten, right? It is the case, as many critics will highlight, there are general prerogatives or there are default positions baked into how the APA is written that favor the government versus private enterprise.
Sure.
And those defaults, I think, need to be evaluated and they need to be reconsidered. Most of them, I would shrink the area of the realm of discretion for those agency administrators, which is not to say, we don't want a law in place. We do. We absolutely do. And I just think it's due for it's not just a tune-up, it needs a significant overhaul.
Well, and you think about it, right? And so much of the good work that CEI is doing, scholars like Ryan Young, Jessica Malugin, and others on the sort of the administrative court system, on these so-called independent agencies and how the deck gets stacked against an individual. I mean, that's something that needs to be, I think, folded into any sort of discussion of reform. I know you would agree with that. I'm sure you would agree with that, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I was just looking the other night, Friday night, I was looking.
And that's sad, Kent, that you were doing this on a Friday night, but go ahead.
Well, it had just come out Thursday.
Yeah.
So in my defense, it was brand new. It was news. One of our major party candidates in this country announced on Thursday in a speech that he'd like to see a special commission. Right?
Yes, I was going to go here.
Commission.
Yeah.
And so I was looking at I read the speech and I was looking at some different aspects of this. And I came to be reminded, right? I was doing some reading and I'd forgotten about this little tidbit, this little trivia.
Yeah.
But it came all rushing back to me. This idea of a commission is not a new thing.
Right.
Basically, it's been around for about 100 years, a little bit more. And it's taken various forms and been more or less effective over the years. But one of the most important of the sort of blue ribbon, how do we organize the government commissions, something called the Brownlow Committee. It's from the 1930s. is FDR era. And the Brownlow Committee went right at the heart, right? Spared no one, and said this headless fourth branch of government is what they called independent agencies. And it was highlighting what a problem it was, and it had recommendations that were not followed or implemented, but it had recommendations way back in 1936 and 7 about how to bring those agencies in. And it was anticipating. The problem was known by the mid-1930s.
Right.
It was anticipating what came with the APA, that we need to create boundaries for these agencies, both of substance, what they're allowed to work on. These are the questions that matter for you, but also procedurally. And those procedural boundaries, those are valuable not just because it allows us to, say, go in and challenge a rule or sue an agency, but because basic procedural rights, civil rights, they need to get rooted somewhere in the law.
Right.
And when you say, like we've seen some of the horror stories of, people are dragged through legal punishments, legal procedural punishments for a decade before they're allowed to build on their land.
Right.
It's the APA that comes into play.
Sure.
Right. That says the EPA or the Department of Interior or whatnot has been abusing these people. And we want those procedural rights in the same way that we want the Bill of Rights, right, which is mostly about civil rights and procedural rights.
So, but it's one of those things where if such a commission were created, I'm assuming CEI would be offering up its recommendations, right? That's they'd be at the forefront of this. One of the groups at the forefront of this, I would hope.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Listen, it underscores the issue because I just remember, our good friends, and I say this, a lot of what we can have a long debate as to about 90% of what the Small Business Administration does. There's this office over there, two offices. There's the Office of the National Ombudsman for Small Business, which talks about regulatory implementation, but the Office of Advocacy. And when it was being run by a guy named Tom Sullivan, who's now at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Tom was really adamant about every year trying to get a list of top 10 regulations for reform. And it was always tough to do because there were so many different people. Again, people are stupid because they're smart, getting them all involved in this. There's so much out there that, folks are going to have to get in the weeds on things like, how we assess regulatory costs, or do we continue to assess regulatory costs versus the benefits, and what constitutes a major rule, getting rid of all of what Circular A6 stuff that was done last year. So there's a lot there. Let me take a step back for a second, Kurt, just sort of in our last couple of minutes here, because I want to talk about more fun things. Because I honestly don't know this. We talked a little bit about your bio. Is this the kind of work you thought you were going to do when you were an undergraduate at Catholic and when you were going to get your master's? I mean, did you know that this is where you wanted to go?
Initially, no. Initially, I was wide-eyed, didn't know anything. I moved from a very small town in the Midwest in Washington, D.C. to study. At Catholic, they call it world politics, but it's foreign policy, diplomacy.
I was an IR major.
Yeah, those sorts of topics. Along the way, I started learning more about domestic policy, and then the first 15 years of my career, I was focused on domestic regulatory questions.
Yeah.
And it really, there's something of a path dependency there, right? The more you learn about something, the more questions you see that you want to explore.
Right.
By the time I went back to graduate school, things were a little bit different. I had a family and I'd done work. I'd seen some of these institutions up close, and I really got interested in some of the public choice dynamics of these things that are ostensibly, like anybody can see, are just bad behaviors. Why do they happen, and what can we do to change them? Right. At the organizational level. So I had this kind of policy-specific background with the regulation of communications law and things like that, and then really started thinking about the institutional questions.
That's good.
It's been a wild ride. The through line is simply that every week, every month, every one of those years, I've had the amazing opportunity to be in a job where my job is to learn things.
Yes.
And I think that's fun.
No,
So
I agree with you. No, it's so funny because I was an international relations major, and I love the IR major because it was broad based. You had to take history and economics and political science and all of those things, and it all sort of conspired together. And then I started working for a blind environmental lawyer who was a constitutional scholar, and sort of that gave me a whole, the application of these things in the real world. Let's talk about the dinner. Because when we release this, I'm hoping you're going to release this the Monday before the CEI dinner. I don't want you to give anything too much away, but I want you to give as much away as you feel comfortable with. Will there be a video? What are you teeing up? I mean, it's in a much bigger, fancier venue than you've ever done, I think. Well, let's talk about the dinner a little bit.
So every year, the Competitive Enterprise Institute hosts this gala, and we focus it. We try to get people's attentions really focused on Julian Simon. We present an award in his honor. Folks don't know about him. I'll encourage you to
please
go to our website. We can talk. I mean, there's hours we could spend on Julian's legacy.
Yeah,
but he's a business economist who took seriously and then rebutted the sort of doomsayer arguments that were prevalent in the 1970s about population, natural resources, the environment, and we think this is wonderful and ought to be celebrated. So we give this award. The awardee this year is a wonderful woman, Senegalese woman named Magat Wade. She's a serial entrepreneur.
Time out for a second. She is the subject of this great film, She Rises Up with Maureen Tusty. We had Maureen Tusty on a couple of weeks ago. She's fantastic.
So Magat will join us and receive the award. Only for the second time.
Yeah.
We've been doing the Simon Award now for more than 2 decades.
Oh, yeah.
Tremendous, set of laureates and folks that have become more involved with CEI as a result of the award. Only the second time, we will be doing a Lifetime Achievement Award.
Wow.
This is a lot of thought went into this and what's appropriate and how do we measure, what counts. George F. Will has now been doing serious academic style work as well as 2 weekly columns for 50 plus years. And George is going to receive the Prometheus Award for Lifetime Achievement, give a keynote address, and will be up at National Cathedral, which is just a stunning place, venue to get together. And I'll add one more detail that I know you know well.
Mm-hmm.
I won't be giving anything away to the audience about you, but so that they know. Unlike most dinners, I by role am on something of a circuit where I need to show up places. We put a lot of energy and effort behind making our gala a party.
Yes,
and people are going to be dancing, and there will be fire walking and all sorts of activities in the National Cathedral and surrounding grounds that we're really looking forward to.
Let me say this. I don't like gala events. I used to when I was younger. Don't like them. Love the CEI dinner, and I've always loved the CEI dinner. I mean, obviously, I'm partial to it because I'm an alumnus, but it is such a great event. It's one that I look forward to. So I'm very much looking forward to that this year. But I totally, I guess, it glossed over the fact that Magat was getting this award, and so it fits in so well with CEI's mission and sort of the issue of conscious capitalism. Maybe no, it's not the right word, but sort of the ethical and moral merits of capitalism and how important it is sort of globally. We talked about this with Maureen Tusty to an extent. Before I let you go, so when I was contemplating adding another podcast to my roster of podcasts, because I do far too many, I had been contemplating doing a podcast called Outside Interests, which was going to focus on folks who are working on politics and public policy issues, but who have these really interesting outside interests here. I know what yours is. The audience does it. Talk about the distance swimming you're doing, and talk about talk about your achievement of swimming the channel. Talk about all of those things.
Wow. Well, there's actually a confluence here.
Yeah.
Ever since I was a little boy, what I really love, and what I love to do with my children, what my wife and I do when we can get away for a weekend, I love being outside.
Yeah.
Right. I hike. I like to camp. I do all sorts of things outside, whether it's kayaking a lake or whatever it might be. And one of my interests has been marathon swimming. And I've been doing open water swimming and long distance swimming probably for a little more than 2 decades. And just a few months ago, just this early in the summer, I checked off a really kind of big ticket life list item in that I swam the English Channel.
That's crazy. That's amazing, though.
It is. I think it's bonkers. I think it's crazy. But it's also wonderful, right?
Sure.
It's set aside like which is true. I mean, there's a sense of accomplishment and things of that sort. Set that aside. It's just beautiful.
Yeah.
Right. Everybody has a chance every day to see a beautiful sunrise.
Yeah.
I assure you, seeing a sunrise at sea level, where your eyeballs are literally at sea level, it's unlike anything else.
How long did it take you? When did you start? When did you finish?
The preparation was about 2.5 years. The actual swim was 13 hours,
Wow.
13:27, 13 and a half. I pushed off a place called Shakespeare Beach, just south of Dover, England, at about a couple minutes after 2 a.m. And I think that means I got to France at 2 p.m. because
3
there's a time change.
Right? Oh, there's a time change. I forgot about that.
I don't know.
Makes sense. Yeah.
I wasn't paying attention to details by that, at that point of the day.
It's like me when I fly to when I go to Tallahassee and I fly through Panama City. I always forget that there's Panama City's a different time zone than Tallahassee. It messes me up. Well, Kent, listen, that's fantastic. Congratulations on that accomplishment. Congratulations on 40 years of CEI. We wish you many, many, many more, and I will see you at the National Cathedral. How do folks find out more about the Competitive Enterprise Institute, the good work you guys are doing?
Drop in on us. Join us at cei.org. Very straightforward. CEI for Competitive Enterprise Institute. There's a full retinue of programming, including events and a couple of podcasts that people can find of interest. And we're right downtown, so if you have an interest, you can also pop in on us. Just let us know ahead of time, and we'll roll out the red carpet for any of your listeners.
Go. Appreciate that. All right. Well, thank you very much, Ken, for that. That was Kent Lassman. He is the president of the Competitive Enterprise Institute, CEI.org. This has been yet another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. Please go and check us out. If you're watching us on YouTube, go and check us out on one of those fine podcast platforms. If you have those fancy waterproof earbuds, you can listen to us as you do your marathon swimming on any of those fine podcast platforms. But if you'd rather just sort of chill out, you can watch us on YouTube, see what we're up to here in the studio. Leave a like, leave a review, hit that subscribe button. As I said, I'm Andrew Langer. Have a great week, everybody, and please enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.